Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to listen and exchange on the insights and key findings from the SLOCAT Transport Climate and Sustainability Global Status Report. My name is Alice Yu, and I'll be your host for today's meeting. It's a very exciting moment for us to launch the third edition of our flagship knowledge series, which tells us the global and regional stories of where we are and where we need to get to urgently on climate and sustainability action for transport and mobility. The GSR equips decision makers towards knowledge-based action, and it aims to raise ambition in transport policy and investment for people and the planet. As you learned from the video just now, the report consists of 5 thematic modules covering 12 transport areas, including 5 spotlights on cross-cutting issues, as well as 30 country fact sheets. New for this edition, the report was released in a modular approach from June to September 2023, which synthesizes knowledge and data more systematically and helps our readers comprehend specific issues more effectively. The full report was finally launched yesterday at Germany's Transport and Climate Change Week in Berlin. Along with the full report, the takeaways for decision makers were also released. This section outlines a critical overview of key trends, challenges, and opportunities in the intersection between transport, climate, and sustainability. It aims to provide food for thought and action in support of decision makers interested in advancing the transformation towards sustainable low carbon transport. Next slide, please. So these are the products that we're presenting to you today, and we would be drawing key insights from these documents with you today. So without further ado, I would like to first invite Marusha, our Secretary General, to share the key insights from the GSR with us. We will then have the privilege to hear regional insights from the GSR delivered by Robert Ebanda, SLOCAT FREV Young Leader, and Nicola Midimoric, our Director on Data Analysis and Research from SLOCAT, and Martina Puckno, who is the Sustainable Mobility Coordinator from Sustentar. And after the regional insights, we will have a panel discussion. Marusha, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks everyone for being here with us today. Let's move to the next slide, please. Colleagues, as we all know, the world has experienced significant challenges and major crises during the past couple of years, and moreover, 2023 has added record-breaking heat waves and the hottest July in modern history, record ice loss in Antarctica and Greenland, and other extreme weather events attributed to human-caused global warming. Amid these challenges, progress towards global targets for increased climate action and sustainability are being jeopardized. Halfway point through the United Nations 2030 Agenda and its Sustainable Development Goals, it is estimated that none of the 17 SDGs will be met in their entirety, and that only 12% of the targets within those SDGs could be achieved. This includes several SDGs that relate directly to the transport sector, such as SDGs on health, on energy, on industry, innovation and infrastructure, on cities, on climate change, of course. Next slide, please. Beyond the often devastating human toll that these events are having, there is also a substantial impact on transport globally. They have exacerbated ongoing challenges in the sector, increased uncertainty, revealed vulnerabilities, all of that resulting in a general downgrading on the urgency of climate and sustainability concerns. Next, please. In the decade from 2010 to 2019, transport experienced the fastest growth in CO2 emissions among combustion sectors, with global transport emissions rising 2% annually and 18% overall. Even in a low carbon pathway, transport is projected to be the second highest emitter of CO2 among energy and use sectors after industry by 2032, and the highest emitter by 2050, mainly due to long distance air travel. Next slide, please. In 2019, transport accounted for 22% of global fossil CO2 emissions. In 2020, you're thinking about the pandemic, the biggest drop ever in emissions occur in our sector. But in 2021, transport recorded the strongest rebound amongst all sectors. Why is this happening? Why these level of emissions? This is the result of several factors. For starters, the near complete dependency on fossil fuels, which supply 96% of the energy demand in transport, a share that has barely changed over the past decade. Despite the rapid growth in both renewables and electric mobility, electric vehicles are only amounting to around 1% of vehicles globally in 2022, and only with renewable energy providing around a quarter of the power supply to these vehicles. The second reason, of course, is a slow progress in reducing emissions from the so-called hard-to-abate sectors, for instance, long-distance road freight, aviation, and shipping. We also have to think about the overall increase in energy demand and in vehicle fleet. We are certainly seeing improvements on energy efficiency thanks to technology, but these are being overweighted by the rise in transport emissions that are due to an overall growth in transport demand, but also to shifts to more polluting modes. We have to also think about the ever-increasing size of passenger vehicles. The popularity of sport utility vehicles and trucks is posing a huge challenge, both in terms of reducing energy consumptions and emissions. And last but not least, there is the prevalence of many older, more polluting vehicles on world's roads. And all that because of the large global second-hand vehicle market, with nearly 2/3 of the main importing countries, mostly low and middle income countries, lacking regulations to ensure affordable access to higher quality vehicles. Next, please. While demand for passenger transport is growing and global freight activity continues growing, road transport across passenger and freight contributed more than 3/4 of transport CO2 emissions in 2019. Emissions from freight represent a growing share of the global transport emissions, right now 42%. Over 2/3 of those freight emissions are from road transport. Freight transport emissions are very likely to continue growing with rising demand for deliveries and transport of goods, longer supply chains, and shifts to air freight. If this is not checked, we're not going into the right trajectory. Today, international production operates with global value chains, and as of 2021, about 70% of international trade involved global supply chains. This places the shortening of global supply chains at the very heart of decarbonization and also of resilience. In recent years, we have seen multiple crises and supply shortages that have demonstrated the fragility of global supply and logistic chains and their interdependencies. For instance, the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index recorded an all-time high value, 4 times above the historical average from previous years. Next, please. In 2020, CO2 emissions from international aviation took a real hit. They fell 45%. That returned them to pre-millennium levels. Since then, there has been an increase. We are still below 2019 levels, but we keep increasing. The International Civil Aviation Organization recently set a target to achieve net zero carbon emissions by mid-century. This remains aspirational and is insufficient to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. We see a completely different development on maritime transport. International shipping produces more transport CO2 emissions than Africa and Oceania combined. And an important anecdote, as much as 40% of maritime trade consists of transporting fossil fuels around the world. International shipping CO2 emissions grew in 2021, exceeding pre-pandemic levels. The reason is that maritime freight didn't really go on standstill during pandemic. And you might be thinking, what about these, targets set by the International Maritime Organization trying to raise ambition to a target of 70% emission reduction by 2040? This is placing the sector within a carbon budget that would be aligned with containing global temperature rise under 2 Celsius degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, but is insufficient in a 1.5 Celsius scenario. Next, please. Let's now move from decarbonization to access. The findings of our report are showing that most of the world's population is lacking access to affordable, sustainable transport. Only 32% African urban population and 38% in Asia have convenient access to transport. That compares to a global average of 56%. In some African cities, 95% of all motorized transport is happening in informal transport services. We have seen no reduction in traffic deaths for the decade, despite the rightly ambitious targets set at the global level. Traffic crashes remained the leading cause of death under 30-year-olds worldwide. Transport expenditures are making often a very high share of household budgets. For instance, in Latin America, it's 70% of household spending going into transport. When we talk about air quality, we can tell you that land transport contributes 5% of the mortality from particulate matter, with quite important divergences and differences across regions. There have also been great improvements, momentum for proximity planning, like the 15-minute CT, policy responses to walk-in, investments in cycling lanes, and bike sharing systems. So we are going in a good direction in that sense. Let's now check the situation on adaptation and resilience. As we know, climate change greatly increases the vulnerability of populations as well as transport systems. Beyond the often heavy human toll, extreme weather events can also have severe impacts on transport-related infrastructure. We also know that sea level rise is anticipated to increase traffic congestion and to lead to increased flooding and damage to transport infrastructure. Direct damage to transport systems worldwide is estimated in $15 billion annually, of which an estimated 8 billion occurs in low and middle income countries, which experience the highest costs relative to the GDP. Businesses in these countries experience around $107 billion annual losses. And of course, the monetary impacts of transport disruptions are far exceeding any physical damage to the assets. Extreme weather and rising sea levels are hindering public and informal transport use. And in many places, the existing infrastructure available is not equipped to protect users adequately. This is negatively impacting on people's access to transport and to basic goods and services, for example, by leading to increased flooding or by damaging public transport infrastructure. The good news is that international financial institutions are increasing investment in more resilient transport systems. However, there remains a huge gap compared to the adaptation finance requirements. The estimated need for adaptation finance in low and middle income countries is 5 to 10 times greater than the current investment that we are seeing flowing in that direction. Colleagues, this is where transport is. The transport sector is not on track to achieve its global climate and sustainability goals, and there is only one way to go, and that is the drastic reductions in transport emissions and improved access to integrated transport systems worldwide. Next, please. For transport, this means very urgent action. Achieving a low-carbon transport pathway that limits global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will require at least a 59% reduction in transport-related CO2 emissions by mid-century compared to 2020 levels. If we look at more ambitious scenarios, there are some scenarios that are even talking about a 90% reduction. Next slide, please. To address this reality, global systemic transformation in how people and goods are moved is urgently needed. Transport systems need to become more equitable, accessible, healthy, green, resilient, sustainable, and environmentally friendly. Collective, active, and electrified transport is the way forward. We know very well that the car-centric and fossil-based models of development, they were once believed to be the pinnacle of advanced societies and economic and technological progress and prosperity, but they have long proven to us that they result in higher, more negative externalities and impacts. However, too often, this inequitable, unhealthy, and unsustainable car-centric model is still the default, and there is lack of avoid and shift strategies for healthier populations and economies. At the same time, it's fair to admit that many decision makers remain underinformed about the benefits of developing transport systems sustainably. You might be wondering, so what happens with the current policies? Are those current policies, the commitments and the targets, getting us on track? We are somewhat stuck on complacency. Without more ambitious policies towards the structural and systemic transformation, transport emissions could grow as much as 50% by mid-century. If we take a look at the current nationally determined contributions submitted by countries under the Paris Agreement, we can tell you that they will contribute to an average global temperature rise of 2.8 Celsius degrees by the end of this century. There remains in those strategies a disproportionate focus on improved measures, while the IPCC is telling us that a combination of public transport-focused development and mixed land use can reduce GHG emissions around 23% by mid-century. By last year, just over 3% of cities worldwide had a low-emission zone in place or planned, and only 10% had a sustainable urban mobility plan. However, we are seeing good progress. Things are going in the good direction, and there's more and more cities going that way. It's also fair to say that the electrification agenda is focusing mainly on electric cars. It must go beyond and address also 2- and 3-wheelers, public transport and freight, and be aligned with a transition towards renewables. The private sector, of course, plays an essential role in climate action. Roughly 100 companies around the world were responsible for 71% of the GHG emissions between 1998 and 2015. We see a growing number of companies across all sectors globally, including transport, committing to reducing their emissions. However, in order to achieve the transport decarbonization at the required level, we're going to have a wider range of businesses involved. including manufacturers, providers of public and freight transport services, as well as companies that use transport. For example, in order to reach the 1.5 Celsius degrees target, the global automotive sector is going to have to increase its annual production of zero-emission vehicles to 52% of the total vehicle production in just a few years. Next slide. Increasing the level of investment and shifting the existing investment practices and subsidies is going to be fundamental. Next slide. Tracked climate change finance averaged $585 billion annually in 2019 and 2020, which is less than a quarter of the estimated needs to achieve the global goals, and only a small share of that is covering transport decarbonization projects. International finance investments from development financial institutions for transport achieved $169 billion, which is actually an increase compared to a previous period. This is far, however, from what is needed. For example, achieving net zero CO2 emissions in the aviation sector by mid-century is estimated to cost at least $5 trillion. Improving road transport efficiency to meet the 1.5 Celsius degree target would cost around $3 trillion. This is demonstrating the need to reassess funding priorities and exploring new opportunities for mobilizing large-scale private investment towards more sustainable objectives. Of course, repurposing the funds that go into fossil fuel subsidies towards more sustainable low-carbon transport solutions is going to be a must. The World Bank is telling us that countries' expenditures in subsidizing fossil fuel consumption are 6 times greater than the amount the countries are pledging in commitments under the Paris Agreement. Good news, government, business, others are starting to nominally address adaptation and resilience for transport, but adequate integration, action, and investment to maintain basic services and basic assets are still missing. Colleagues, a bit to wrap up here from my side. Very few of these messages are new. I mean, humankind has gone through multiple crises, and we are likely to encounter many others in the future. But there is solid evidence that the climate and inequality crises are enduring ones. And there is also solid evidence that we do have a good number of applicable tools and solutions to address them. A lot has been learned along the way. We have learned that marginal, incremental progress is not enough. We have seen some stakeholders withholding progress almost at any cost. We have seen other stakeholders rising to the occasion, becoming leaders, visionaries, change makers. We have seen some countries understanding the meaning behind a just transition in the transport sector. We are seeing some cities prioritizing access to transport for all. We have also learned that governments, if they want, they can act overnight, redirecting policies and funding in the right direction. We saw that during the pandemic. We'll continue seeing it during the ongoing energy crisis. Colleagues, thanks for listening. In a nutshell, the main takeaway from this 3rd edition of the Global Status Report is that drastic shift from the status quo is necessary to achieve a systemic transformation of transport and mobility. And these changes are going to come with society-wide positive impacts. That's the main message. Back to you, Alice, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Marusha. Allow me to remind our participants that you're very welcome to share your questions using the chat box function in the Q&A segment that follows in just a moment. So now we would like to move on to the regional insights. So the floor is yours, Robert. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. And I think as rightly mentioned, my name is Robert Tambunda from the University of Namibia, and I'll give some key insights from the African regional overview. So if we look at the transport sector, we find that it contributes a large chunk of CO2 emissions on the African continent, which is about a quarter of all contributors. So that's about 24%. Even though holistically, if we look at the region, it has the lowest per capita transport CO2 emissions among all the world's regions, but it's picking up quite steeply. And this is notable from, you can see that Africa experienced the 2nd highest regional growth of transport emissions, only after Asia. Next slide, please. So we find that the fast-growing emissions from the transport sector have also resulted in very dangerous levels of air pollution in the region. And this can be seen from those high levels of particulate matter, 2.5 at 97 micrograms per cubic meter. And this is mainly from transport and power generation, which when compared to the world average, we can see that it's quite high. So from that, we also notice that it's not all doom and gloom, though, on this frontier, because there are efforts to tackle transport emissions, which have picked up, and African decision makers have also tried to take the lead in setting time-bound actions through policy. And that is from the review of NDCs, where we found that Africa accounted for 43% of the countries that set time-bound transport emission targets as per the submitted Paris agreements. So this is very encouraging in terms of the political will to address some of the climate changes, or rather challenges that we're experiencing on the continent. On the road safety front, Africa has really experienced soaring road safety, or rather road fatalities in general, and worse so for the vulnerable users on our roads. And we find that 53% of all fatalities are vulnerable road users, that being pedestrians, bi, and motorcyclists. And this is worsened by the fact that 93% of Africa's roads fail to provide an acceptable level of service for pedestrians and cyclists. So we still have some way to go regarding reducing safety risk of our users and meeting targets pertaining to the UN's Global Road Safety Action Plans. Next slide, please. So we also found that between 2016 and 2020, Africa's vehicle ownership rate was 4.6 times below the global average, standing at 43 vehicles per 1,000 people. But despite that low vehicle ownership rate, the region is highly dependent on used vehicles, importing the largest share of used vehicles, representing about 40% among all the regions during almost the same period. In some African countries, used vehicles account for almost the whole fleet, which research has also shown that can also be attributed to the high crash rates and high emission levels due to poor conditions of most of these vehicles. With the low vehicle ownership rates in the region, that essentially means that a high proportion of our communities are walking and cycling, with cycling varying in different contexts. So walking and cycling are the primary means of transport in the regions, with Africans spending about 56 minutes a day on walking and cycling. So policymakers and decision makers in the region recognize the importance of these primary means of transport. And this is reflected in that 59% of people walking and cycling in Africa are supported by a walking and cycling policy. Next slide, please. So in order for us to alleviate urban poverty and improve the socioeconomic standing of the majority, we need to improve affordable mobility in the region. Mobility generally in the African region is not affordable for the urban poor. In some instances, we find that transport takes up between 10% and 20% of household expenses. We also find that only about 32% of the population was able to access public transport within a reasonable range of 500 to 1,000 meters. And this is way below the global average of 56%. Also, there is a prevailing use of informal modes of transport, which accounts for between 40 and 98% of trips in some African countries. So a ton of opportunities in that space as well to look at. On the freight frontier, road freight carries at least 80% of all goods in Africa, and other modes remain quite limited, mostly due to high costs involved and a lack of capacity and technology. So behind all the data and behind all the statistics, there's a trove of opportunities for the region to catapult itself and transform even further towards sustainable and climate-sensitive transport. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Nicola, you're next.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I will now present the key insights for Asia. Actually, this section was authored by Hannah Murdoch and Ambika Sairam with contributions from Uda Eichhorst. So now, looking at Asia, Asia is the highest absolute transport CO2 emitter among all regions. As you saw, it has the strongest growth exceeding Africa. It experienced the fastest growth in transport CO2 emissions from 2010 to 2019. But actually, transport only accounted for 11% of the region's total CO2 emissions. Next slide, please. Major transport issues connected to climate and sustainability in Asia are air pollution, emissions, as I mentioned, and the rapid increase in road vehicles. The first topic, air pollution, here which is partly caused by road transport, but also many other causes. Here it leads up to 4.5 million premature deaths in Asia. Regarding transport emissions, the previous slide already outlined the current situation, but then also it's very important to mention if the current trend is not reversed, we will see a continuous growth of transport emissions in the region. And then the last issue here, some Asian countries saw an increase of over 200% in car ownership rates. And it's not only limited to cars, also two-wheelers, three-wheelers are rising very rapidly, and they're causing congestion, pollution, and are causing road safety issues in cities and rural areas of Asia. Next slide, please. On the bright side, Asia is also the global leader on several fronts. 95% of electric vehicles of worldwide operate in Asia, of which actually also a very large majority are electric two-wheelers. Asian cities provide high-quality public transport and continue to further expand bus rapid transit, bus systems, urban rail at a very high rate. And as you can see, in addition, there are at least 14 Asian countries that have economy-wide pledges towards net zero emissions. And we hope that it will expand further. Then next slide, please. Asia is also the largest bike-sharing market in the world. There are more than 800 bike-sharing schemes in operation as of 2021. But also Asia, as you know, is a major center for trade and the economy, the global economy. Here, the decarbonization of shipping is also important. However, there's currently only very few initiatives aiming to decarbonize ports and to establish green shipping corridors. This needs to further scale up and expand in the next years. Then, the use of renewables in transport have recorded very strong, the strongest growth in Asia in the last decade. But then actually the main reason is because Asia starts from very low baselines, so the relatively growth was very, very large. However, a lot more efforts need to be done to combine vehicle electrification with renewable energy, waste biofuels, and other zero-emission or low-carbon fuels. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm passing it to Martina Pugner from Association of System.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thanks SLOCAT for inviting us to this webinar. It is an honor for us to collaborate in this global report. Edition after edition, it has been improving, incorporating new approaches, consolidating as a reference and consultation document. So at this time, we present the key regional insight of Latin America and the Caribbean, starting with global incidence in terms of emissions. In LAC, 33% of the total carbon dioxide comes from transport. LAC has relatively small impact on global transport emissions, despite having less high levels of motorization. Numbers have been growing in the last decade in the order of 3%, reaching 8.5% of the global transport carbon dioxide emissions in 2021. On the next slide, we can see, as mentioned, the high level of motorization is related to the high car ownership rate, 1.35 times above the global average. This is very related to the limited access to public transport and in the region that remains a challenge. In 2/3 of the cities served in the region, just half or less of the population had convenient access to public transport. Thinking about the avoid, shift, and improve model, these 2 points are key to upgrade the sustainability perspective of the sector in the region. But let me also tell you that public transport systems are emerging despite leadership loss. Bolivia, Ecuador, Mexico, and Panama have examples of new operational systems in 2022. If we continue with the next slides, it shows that in the main cities like Bogotá, Lima, Mexico, and Rio de Janeiro, priority for cycling is growing, putting value in investments to expand cycle lanes, bicycle parking, and shared systems. This point is very important for the region, shifting many travel modes and empowering citizens to understand the changes that must be made. Latin America and the Caribbean is with a constant motivation for integrated transport planning. Sustainable urban mobility plans continued to expand in countries such as Brazil, Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, and Peru. And many countries rapidly deployment electric bus fleets. This technology doubled the fleet between 2020 and 2023, accounting for nearly 5% of the regional urban fleet. In the next slide, and finally related with region, we can see that that are prevailing development of climate strategies. More than 90% of LAC countries submitted second-generation NDCs. Even more, 4 countries include transport emission targets. Talking about freight, we have a long way for modal shift. Road transport carries 85% of national freight in South America and almost all of the freight in Central America. At this point, the challenge is to be creative enough in presenting alternatives that allow the problem to be resolved in a comprehensive, holistic, and multi-sectoral form, strengthening development. Finally, it must be said that some countries are making efforts to decarbonize freight. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico launched programs in this way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank again to our colleagues and also Martina and Robert for sharing the insights with us. With that, I would like to open the floor for questions. So actually, we do have the first question from Augustina Krapp, and she congratulates us on the amazing work and also to the community that contributed to the work. And she has one question for the panelists. And this 3rd edition includes a new chapter on adaptation and resilience, which is great to see. It seems that climate conversations have not previously given enough attention to transport adaptation in contrast to mitigation. Why do you think this is? So anyone from the SLOCAT team, or Robert and Martina, you're very welcome to provide your response to this question.
Yeah, if you want, I can start.
Thank you,
so
Nicola.
kind of with the issue on transport adaptation is very much that there's much less data, first of all, available on this topic than we have on mitigation, on kind of all these and low carbon transport pathways. There are many kind of course, local examples, local impacts of kind of the extreme weather events and things, loss and economic and the damages being done by certain extreme weather events. And then we have certain global studies who try to give like a big picture overview of the extreme weather events and kind of how adaptation needs to look like, or the levels of adaptation needed, or the investments needed on the adaptation. But then the in-between level is also very important for us, kind of the national response, how the countries react in terms of implementing more transport adaptation and resilience is quite tricky and much more difficult to identify and to put into a report. In the past, for example, in the 1st edition, we also assessed the national adaptation plans by countries, but I believe this a little bit like kind of the release of national adaptation plans was mostly done back then. There are not many new like NAPs or national adaptation plans being submitted since then, so nothing really new comes from there. But and of course, we have the NDCs there. We touched on adaptation, but then there's still like kind of more and more resources actually that are still missing, or knowledge gaps and so on, that we further need to explore and see how to better highlight adaptation in the future. Yeah, I see Marushi raised your hand.
Thanks very much, Nicola. I just wanted to bring a point here that probably is in the minds of our participants right now, which is that let's not forget that I think that until relatively recently, there was this sense in the international community that adaptation and resilience in general, not only for transport, was a matter that was affecting low and middle income countries, and that had absolutely nothing to do with high income countries. I think that the exacerbation of extreme weather events provoked by human-induced climate change is, of course, provoking a lot of terrible human and financial losses, but it's also acting somehow as an equalizer. I think that everywhere around the world, countries, all mixed, are seeing what it needs to have to adapt, to have to be resilient, and we are seeing that impact in transport services. We have recently seen in countries of the most developed parts of the world how transport systems are being extremely impacted in the case of floodings and all that. So I think that that is somehow playing as well. And of course, it has played in the climate negotiations, in which in many occasions, the discrepancies between the needed focus on adaptation and resilience have perhaps a bit fueled the traditional divides between, if I may use, global South and global North in those international negotiations. Yeah, perhaps we're all learning now that we're all in this together, and that is, I think, bringing more attention in international negotiations and equally around funding. That would be a bit my more general question, not necessarily answer, not only focusing on transport. Thanks.
Thank you, Marusha. We have also received another question from Musiani Chewi, and he asked that what policy instrument can developing countries develop and implement to accelerate zero-emission transport, public and non-motorized transport? So I think it would be nice if we can hear any regional insights, perhaps from Robert or Martina, from your experience, perhaps.
I feel like there are many policy instruments to be developed in many countries, not only in the developing countries. No, they must be brought through many planning strategies, processes. I feel like that's the key in which we have to work and discover these points. There are many policy instruments, as I said, but they must be holistic and they must be integrated. We must push these things like financial instruments, normatives, specified, for example, pulling the cars, putting value in the active modes in the cities. And I feel like we must put very light sides in freight. Policy instruments about freight are very difficult because they involve a lot of actors, different actors that have different interests. And I feel like this is the most challenge or the most difficult challenge we have, especially in Latin America and the Caribbean.
All right, perhaps to add to what Martina has said, I think it's important to emphasize that, like she mentioned, it's important for us not to plan and develop policy in silos, either just developing a policy for non-motorized transport without considering how it fits into the other modes of transports within the area, either public transport or other forms of transports that are available. And it's important for us to actually go out there and engage with people who are actually using the modes of transports that are available. Because I've noticed, especially within my context, you find that a policy is developed and then a sidewalk is put up, but no one is using it. And it comes from the point where people have not actually gone out and engaged the users to see what their preferences are, what the challenges are in terms of some of the modes that they're utilizing on a day-to-day basis. So just to add that it's important for us during policy development to ensure that we are not only thinking in silos, but we are also thinking holistically, like Martina has mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these excellent responses. And I feel like it somehow leads to the next question or answer parts of it. It's from Christopher Seaman when he asks, what are some of the pressures against decarbonization? Is that political, inertia, or attitudes? So, Robert, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, sure, Alice. I was working on a project with the Lee Shipper Memorial Scholarship where I had to speak to some of the politicians and decision makers at the small and medium towns in terms of their perceptions in non-motorized transports, how they go about the planning of this non-motorized transport. And what I found is that there seems to be a lack of I don't want to say education, but since they are not sensitized to the importance of the mode to improving the socioeconomic aspect of people's lives or the communities in which they serve. So I think it's important for us as practitioners to also inform the political players, the decision makers, the policy makers, how some of these modes of transports actually play into improving the lives of the people who are actually using the modes of transport. So on my side, I think it's just a lack of awareness, which we need to improve on. And I think as practitioners, we need to be proactive as well in terms of going out there and not just sitting in our offices and coming up with solutions, going out there, engaging some of these politicians. You might be surprised. Most people are willing to listen and to actually learn how they can improve their decision-making processes in terms of improving their lives through improving transportation. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. And now we have a question for South America. So from Jairo, where it says that my question is, what is the viewpoint SLOCAT or partners or experts today about to promote cycling transport in overcrowded cities? Do we see if South America is working in policies related to this field enough? So obviously, I think this question goes to you, Martina.
I am rereading. Give me a minute. There are many things to do about promoting cycling transportation, even in overcrowded cities. First of all, I feel like we have to educate every citizen in the public place. The streets are the public place for excellence. So there we have a place to negotiate and give priorities. Even in any role we work in. I feel like promoting cycling transportation must be, as I said, must be take in an holistic way. For example, we must promote cycle lines, but we must promote cycling parking, because when you move, you need to put your bicycle in some way. But I feel like the most important thing is going step by step, giving the place that cycling and non-motorized modes need in the streets, and this is something we must do with education for citizens. I feel like cycling is not most important, but cycling, it must be put in the table with pedestrians. No, they are the vulnerable targets in the streets. So giving education and giving the place they deserve in order to prevent a lot of issues we have in the streets are one of the points we must take.
Thank you, Martina. And with that, I think I want to thank you and Marusha and Nicola and Robert for sharing these insights with us. Also, thank you so much for those who have submitted your questions. You are most recommended to read the recommendations from the takeaways for decision makers in full, and also read the key insights from all of our modules for more facts and figures, which are both available on our website. So now with that, I would like to pass the floor to Marusha, who will introduce and moderate our panel discussion. Marusha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alice. But above all, let me thank obviously Nicola, but Martina and Robert for being with us today, and not only for being with us, for the work that you have put in getting us here, in drafting, in accompanying us is phenomenal. And in the meanwhile, I would also like to ask our fellow panelists to turn the camera on as I see that it's occurring. Let me check that we have got everybody there. I'll give people the time they could need. It's really now a moment for us a bit to, we have flooded you with data, isn't it? We have flooded you with a lot of information. For us now, it's the opportunity a bit to reflect as a community of practitioners from the largest spectrum of backgrounds that are required in this transformation. Of course, it was impossible to have all those backgrounds on the spectrums here, but we are delighted to have with us today a very knowledgeable panel on all these things we are discussing. We have with us Holger Dagman, who is the CEO of Sustain 2023, and Holger has also been the chief advisor in this third edition of the GSR. Not only in this third edition, this has been a long time a partnership in crime around the Global Status Report, and it's been a delight to have Holger again with us in the GSR team. We also have got with us Andreas Angel Leon, who's the executive director for the Global Network for Popular Transport. We have with us as well Lucy Anderton, head of sustainability in the UIC, the International Union of Railways. We have also got Jyoti Bisbay. She's executive committee member and head of partnerships in the World Association of PPP units and PPP professionals. We continue with Alan Lewis. He's the technical development director in the Smart Freight Center. And last but not least, we have with us Rana Adib, executive director of Run21 and also chair of the SLOCAT board of directors. Thanks very much, Madam Chair, for being here with us in such an important day for us as a partnership. So let's get started, and let's all of us, including our participants, please, in the chat, go into that a bit like informal reflection chat. Let's imagine that we're all together in a room and that we want to have this a bit of a thought-provoking chat of what's going on, what's not going well, and where do we need to go. And of course, we have prepared a few questions, but we would like to keep it dynamic enough so then we can interact a bit with the audience. Holger, let me start with you, and let's take a moment to talk about this concept about integrated transport planning. We've seen that he has been receiving quite some increased attention, isn't it, in recent years? So would you say that the pandemic recovery packages have resulted in improvements towards integrated transport planning?
So first of all, good morning, good afternoon, good evening also from Berlin. And I can't resist at least to congratulate you to you and the team, and in fact also to the fantastic GSR, and thanks also for the opportunity also to we're involved in the advisory role. So that's fantastic. Actually, when you presented yesterday at the Transport and Climate Week, Carlos Munoz, the Chilean transport minister, highlighted that the focus is currently lots about electrification of transport, which is important, but will be definitely not sufficient to reduce also the transport carbon emission enough, nor solving also the other transport related issues like better access for all, safety and congestion. So clear message again and again also within the GSR, we need a more balanced attention to avoid, shift and improve. And the GSR report in fact also referred also to the IPCC study saying public transport focus development and mixed land use can reduce emissions by about a quarter by 2050. So it's really important also to look into the link between transport and land use, and also reducing also the vehicle miles traveled. To your question on recovery packages, we've seen also a good narrative, building back better, that was fantastic, and we have seen some positive investment, but it was often also used mainly also to support also public transport also for the main losses and to cope with those losses. And less funding was available also for other issues, like also the more systematic change. And we have seen also fuel subsidies also increasing at the same time. Obviously, also we noticed also during COVID that the ability to act fast, particularly from cities, but also national governments, with more than 1,000 kilometers of bike lanes, like in Bogota and many other cities, were great, and we make them permanent. But it lacked also this overall strategic development. Nevertheless, we have seen, and you highlighted many of the good examples in the GSR, sustainable mobility plans, 10% of cities. You have initiatives like Mobilize Your City, supporting 31 sustainable mobility plans in low middle income countries. That's good news. We have the concept of the 50-minute city gain momentum, not in like in Paris, but we have super blocks in Barcelona, in Berlin, low traffic neighborhoods in London, TOD in several Indian cities. And also you showed us the numbers on low emission zones. However, we're not scaling fast enough. Issues like congestion charge is still at a crossroad. Hopefully at some stage we see in Beijing and New York, which hopefully open up. Parking is often not an issue. Walking in only 25 NDCs. So avoid is still not a sexy thing. It takes long. SUMP progressing. Yes, good, but 10%, when are we actually beers at the 80-90% we actually need? So bottom line, unfortunately, I think we're not on the trajectory towards low carbon and sustainable at scale and pace, and the world really has to speed up.
Yeah, thanks, Holger. We're always sad to have to paint a gloomy picture, isn't it? But it's a reality check. And it's interesting the point you made about to what extent perhaps the recovery packages, like in other instances, are trying to fix what we have been doing badly in the past and trying to seek the immediacy instead of trying to put us on a track towards that transformation, which is, of course, longer term. Thanks very much. I will come back to you in a second round of questions, of course, but let me go now to Lucy, because with Lucy, we have, of course, the railways represented. Think about railways both for passenger and transport, for passenger and freight. Think about a public transport, therefore. Lucy, we know that during the pandemic, there was a significant impact on rail operations and ridership, especially for passenger services, of course. And as economies are bouncing back, how do you see things going? What are the policies that are inspiring, that can actually take us to the change that is needed? Are there any examples, particularly from low middle income countries, that you say like, oh yeah, this is it, they are leading the way? Tell us a bit about the railway panorama, please.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, as you say, like railways, like all public transport, was hit hard in COVID. I mean, if we think about it, they had to run a near exactly the same timetable to get essential workers to work and to keep the social distancing possible. So costs went up, revenues disappeared, and so it was a real change for those. And so freight was more stable, but in both passenger and freight, we're seeing things come back closer to the ridership of 2019 now, but what we're seeing actually is travel patterns changing, and so our members are telling us that they're having to think about their customers' needs in a very different way, and so there's a real like change in and adapting to businesses and timetables and services in quite a different way. People are traveling in different patterns, perhaps more leisure, less business travel, and the commute, the peak times are different than they ever were before COVID. So there's a real like change that we're needing to make, and the railways are really trying to sort of adapt to that. And while railways were sort of supported usually as state-owned companies during the pandemic, not a lot of that kind of Build Back Better and money that we were talking about made its way to public transport expansion or improvement, particularly. And in fact, actually, that's long term. We're not seeing this kind of growth in investment and activity in public transport that we are in road, and that's what you've made clear again in your excellent report, is that the direction in terms of modal share is going in the wrong direction. We're seeing both passenger and ton kilometers share, even though it might be sort of stable or going up a little bit in some countries, it's actually road is rocketing in both investment and activity. So we're really globally a bit significantly worried about this, because IEA are telling us that, you know, if we're really going to decarbonize transport, then railways need to take a much bigger role in transport, and that's something like 40% more by 2030, when we're at the moment going in quite the opposite direction. So there is, as you say, some bright sparks and some countries that are really taking action, because and it's not just one lever that needs to be pulled. It needs to be the whole range of sort of the carrot and the sticks that seem to be successful if you use them all together. So you need a really holistic a sort of approach to that, and a real concerted effort. We're seeing for example, in Europe, they had some high-profile boosts if sort of low-price tickets and season passes that really that was very much marketed as a sort of post-lockdown boost to public transport, and really showing railways as a climate solution. So Austria, Switzerland, all the sort of those global north were really pushing for that, and I think that's you know really inspired others to look at public transport as a climate solution more closely. And so, for example, our members in Chile, and we were talking about Minister Munoz, is a great supporter of public transport, and we're seeing that in our railway member in FA now. So they have got, I was the pleasure of traveling on their product earlier this year, and they've got some incredibly ambitious plans and some really impressive policy backing them up. And they have got clear, specific targets for modal shift and expansion of rail. They've been asked to triple passenger numbers by 2029, double freight by 2026, carbon neutral by 2035. So pretty early. And wonderfully, the other KPI is 30% female workforce by 2026 as well. So really looking quite holistically on how they can really boost rail's place in mobility in that part of the world. Also, like Morocco, first African high-speed rail, brilliant service, and just shows that that Africa can have high-speed rail as well, and we can in fact leapfrog many of the mistakes made in global north, and because technologies can be retrofitted, and really that kind of ambition can be there.
Thanks very much, Lucy, for showing us, that there is ambition and leadership coming from places that perhaps people wouldn't necessarily think of directly, which is, I think, a prioristic views that all need to work on, isn't it, when it's about transport. And I also wanted to underscore something that I think comes up from what you presented, the importance of targets, the importance of a direction to go to, isn't it, and set those targets with ambition and make them legally binding at national level. Thanks very much for that. I'll come back to you. Let me go now to Andrea. Because for us, we've talked about, with you, Lucy, if I may, we've talked, of course, about freight, because rail is also freight, but we have talked about that notion of public transport as we know it in a very formal manner in some places of the world, isn't it? But then we know that informal transport is key and central in many places of the world. And we gave you that data point that tells us that in some African cities, up to 95% of all motorized trips are going to happen in informal transport services. But during the pandemic, wow, those services experienced incredible losses, isn't it, Andrea? We had the pleasure of having you as an author of the chapter in the report that is about this. Actually, many of the speakers today are authors, Lucy as well. I forgot to say that. And in that loss, we necessarily didn't see support from the government to try to plug in those losses that the informal transport sector was experiencing. So, wow, how do we eliminate this tendency of ignoring informal transport services? How do we change this paradigm?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marusha, and all of SLOCAT for having us here. I think we have to kind of come back to the notion of just transition when we're talking about this. And just transition makes us think about, if we are transitioning to a decarbonized economy, if we're transitioning to a decarbonized transport sector, we need to figure out who we might be leaving behind and start pulling them to the same place where we're pushing everything towards decarbonization and making them part of this conversation. I always say that there's this phrase that the disability world uses when they're talking about activism, and it's nothing about us without us. So if we're talking about decarbonizing the transport sector, we can never talk about it without thinking and involving and making part the popular or informal or artisanal or all of the many names we give to the transport services that are not provided by the government or that are not regulated by the government. Because number one, we need to remember that these transport services are essential. They're usually used by the most vulnerable populations. So usually people with lower income that cannot afford other modes of transportation, people who live in places where there is no access to public transportation. The government doesn't reach those places. Sometimes there is no public transportation provided by the government in the whole of the city. And this is what's actually filling the gaps and providing transport access. But there's also the component of drivers, for example, which are usually young people, young men. Many times they are migrants and they can't find other employment opportunities. And this is the opportunity to create a livelihood and support their families or support themselves. And so we need to think of how to involve this sector. And so for that, we always suggest three things. Usually when we talk about informality, people always think about either eradicating or regulating, and that's it. And that's what we have found that doesn't work. Because if you try to eradicate, what is the other choice? What are you offering these populations to keep having transport access? Are you offering something better? Right now, no. Usually the conversation is we're going to build this huge project, a BRT or a train that will take maybe 10, 20 years to come, and we are eradicating this now. Or we are trying to regulate, but we're not providing or supporting the sector in getting to be able to comply with that regulation. So what we usually suggest are three things. First of all, recognition. We need to recognize that this is an essential service that is filling the gaps that the governments are not being able to fill through their public transportation services. And we need to understand the sector. How does it work? How many operators are there? How many vehicles? How are they organized? How are they reaching people? Are they associations? Are they unions? Is there different places where they stand? How do they operate, et cetera, et cetera? And from there, we need to start integrating them into planning. We need to understand them as part of the transport system at the end of the day. If we want to have a decarbonized and well-functioning transport system, we need to understand that this is the system right now. And so if we're planning, we need to integrate this into our planning, not only at the operational level, but also at the street level. I was in the Africa Climate Week a few days ago. I've lost track of time now, jet lag. But we were talking about how would, for example, the notion of a complete street work in the global south with stops for the matatus in Nairobi or for the bodas. It's usually, we just think about a complete street with some trees and sidewalks and for bikes, the bike lanes, or maybe an exclusive lane for buses, but we exclude these modes of transportation and we don't build for them because we want to make them, they're usually invisible and we don't want to plan for them. But how could we integrate these existing modes of transport to planning so that they're actually part of the system? And the final one is, how do we support them? They're not better because they can't be better. They don't have any subsidies. They don't have any government support. So the way we're thinking about them, and we suggest that we think about them, is they are SMEs. They're small and medium enterprises. It's someone that bought a car or bought a tuk-tuk or bought a bicycle or bought a bus and started providing a service. It's usually in many places a one-person operation, maybe a few, they own a couple of vehicles, but they're small and medium enterprises. So how would you approach a sector, or how would you approach a small and medium enterprise to help them become a company that has standards, that has efficiency in their operations, etc.? And what we've seen is now, for example, in South Africa, the South African Development Bank has started to work with the operators in a pilot to help them become a company and organizing the association and different operators to improve their efficiencies, kind of improve their numbers so that they can afterwards change their vehicles. But the SME approach is really important because at the end of the day, if you don't have any government support, transport is not necessarily a great business. You have to cut on other costs, and those cuts make it really important, really difficult to provide a high level service. So recognize, integrate, and support, and that way we can actually get to a mode of transport that provides comfort, efficiency, safety, and that is competitive and that provides a good service to its users.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I'm going to move directly to Jyoti in the interest of time, if I may. Jyoti, let's talk money. So globally, investments of a 2.7 trillion US dollars per year are needed between 2016 and 2030 in order to achieve those low carbon transport pathways that we are talking about. And 60 to 70% of that investment is going to have to go into emerging economies. So how do we make that happen? What are the possible steps to change the investment trajectory that right now is not really going in the right trajectory? Can you give us a bit of a perception of how, if at all, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has impacted on these trajectories of investments? Finance is always a core thing here, isn't it? It's almost the lifeblood of all these transformations, only with policy that we're talking about. So I think we're all very, very curious about what you got to tell us.
Sure. Thank you, Marusha, and good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to everybody. And really thank you to SLOCAT and bringing World Association of PPP Units and Partnerships and Professionals to this global forum and this discussion. Yes, definitely my perspective is from the finance and how and where the money goes. And that really is a really good tell on what is really the gap between the planning and where actually where the money is actually being put. And so let me actually start from the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the impact is still emerging, and we still don't understand many of the. Maybe we can feel the primary impact, but we still don't understand the secondary effects to the not only just to the regional economy, but to the global, and really more importantly to the global supply chains. I think the first and the immediate impact of the war was it pushed up the energy prices, and some of the things actually you've covered in your presentation. In the beginning, consumers were affected, businesses, governments. It hurt the households, industries, economies, and what we didn't expect the immediate effect is going to be. It actually hurt the low and middle income countries, and they were far away from this particular region, but there were ripple effects because of the shortfalls of the of the production of the oil, and then the shift to natural gas, and then the new infrastructure being built, and then it had a direct impact on the global supply chains. And the second immediate impact, was on the financial markets. Capital markets were impacted heavily. The activity actually went down in 2022, especially and since the topic of today, the sustainability, the thematic bonds, actually they fell almost 24% in 2022. So these were the kind of the immediate impacts, and the far-reaching impact we actually felt all the way to in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's a statement from the World Bank especially that the war has halted the fiscal consolidation process in many of these low and middle income countries, which were just starting to come out of the pandemic economic crisis, and because of the supply chain, the food supplies from Ukraine, the fuel prices, all that has impacted the macroeconomic balance of low and middle income countries. The effect was on subsidies, the waivers, the tariffs, the levies, so it has really kind of caught up with all this. Now, I also want to mention through all this, all these challenges, I think we need to recognize the innovation which has come because of this challenge, because of this energy crisis, which has impacted the macroeconomics, is this the European Union's renewable energy power goal. And it has really pushed that maybe the last incentive or the last in a way, how we can really come out of this is into low carbon hydrogen. And that has their targets, formal targets in the United Kingdom. There's also a lot of construction going on, a lot of ideas how we can incorporate this. And as a result, the investment in this particular innovative idea has gone up in this particular sector. So I think the second part to your question in terms of where the money is going, I think that's an interesting, and I want to bring one of the statistics which you presented in your presentation, that among the G20 countries in 2022, 42% of public funding actually went to the transport sector investments. But even that 42% of the investment went to the 46%. So almost half of that investment went to road transport. And that number, if you see that trend, and if you combine that with the rise in transport emissions, and the third factor, which is the transport sector's continued reliance on fossil fuels and continued fossil fuel subsidies in transport, that's a big tell of where the goals are set versus where the money is going. And obviously we are not really incentivized the right change in behavior. And that is not going to give us the results which we keep flashing in our headlines, in political statements, and saying that we are going to actually make this shift. So we are not going to get to the point of our political goals when the money is not going in the same direction.
Yeah, thanks very much.
So I'll stop here.
No, that's excellent, and you're already linking into what I suspect part of the topic that probably Rana is going to want to address at some point during her questions, where the money is going in terms of that nexus between transport and energy. But let's talk a bit now about freight, please, and let's move to Alan. Alan is with us from the Smart Freight Center, and like everyone else, including GOT as well, they have contributed to the chapters, or they have directly drafted the chapters that you can see in the Global Status Report this year. And Alan, in my presentation at the beginning, I evoked this figure from 2021 telling us that an estimated 70% of international trade involves global value chains, and what that means instead of decarbonizing those value chains, and in terms as well of making them resilient and adapted, isn't it, to all the impacts that they are seeing. So what are the emerging innovations, particularly in the hard to decarbonize subsectors that you are seeing and you think are being the most impactful?
Okay, thanks, Marisha. Hi there, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And I mean, the short answer to your question would be to target that point that's just been raised about reducing the reliance on fossil fuels as much as we can. So for trucks, we'd be looking at electrification linked into a rapid expansion in the availability of low carbon electricity. Hydrogen there may be limited to a niche for the heaviest and longest distance transport. For shipping, provision of a wider range of low carbon energy solutions combined with operational efficiency measures. For aviation, again, a rapid expansion in the availability of low emission sustainable aviation fuel, linked to strict sets of sustainability criteria, but again, linked to increased technical energy efficiency actions and fleet renewal probably as well. Now, that's only a quick headline answer, and I've tried hard to avoid falling into the trap of only mentioning those solutions related to clean energy, because we really will need all of the pillars that are available to reduce the emissions from transport. So reducing demand linked to those global supply chains, modal shift measures, system efficiency within a mode, and energy efficiency at sort of vehicle operational level. So that they all have to contribute. When assessing emissions, it's really important to consider total emissions alongside an understanding of the inherent intensity of each mode. That links into how much transport activity is actually conducted mode by mode, and what the other factors are that then drive that transport purchase modal choice within that. If you look at the picture in that way, you see that global shipping, it contributes around 21% of freight transport emissions within the supply chains, but it's based around 70% of the transport activity because of the length of the supply chains that the global shipping would be involved with. So you can see that there's an inherent relative efficiency there within shipping for all the large contribution that it makes. And you can contrast that to aviation, where it contributes around 7% of freight transport emissions, but actually it contributes that from a very small proportion of the total transport activity. And in a way, that's a good thing, because it's a very, very emission intense mode, but it's also a very costly mode. And that means it does tend to be used by the majority of players away from high value goods, more as a sort of an emergency in freight transport chains. And then road transport there, it contributes the biggest share of emissions because it's ubiquitous, and it really has to be the place that if we were going to focus our efforts, we really should be focusing on how we avoid it and how we act on it. So if there are large investments going into road transport, I pray, but I'm not convinced, that they're all about efficiency and energy transition rather than, oh, let's just carry on with what we know, because I think that would not be a good move. Commercial decision making around freight transport is very reactive. If someone has some goods and they want the consignment to be moved from point A to point B in a certain way, then they'll always find someone in the commercial market willing to provide that service. Companies react then within the prevailing legislative environment, you hope, but unless business decision making puts more emphasis on greenhouse gases and links that to some form of cost mechanism to focus minds, the same decisions will continue to be made. And that recognizes that currently transport usually represents a small and rather unwelcome often part of the final total cost of a product. So in that context, yeah, possibility to reduce demand through shortening supply chains, which is beginning to get some mention, but I don't think it's necessarily mentioned in its own right. It's more about, well, what resilience can we bring into supply chains? Oh, and by the way, that would reduce transport demand and then maybe lead to a reduction in emissions. And I think there's an important point to link to that. And that's that if you actually reduce transport demand, it would probably get reflected in lower GDP numbers. And those lower GDP numbers are never a good look for a politician. So there needs to be a way to think around those things as well. But I'll leave it for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alan, because I think that in this answer that you've given us, you're really showing us how a lot of the transformations we are talking about are really somehow about changing some entrenched approaches in socio-economic systems in different countries, isn't it? So thanks
Absolutely.
very much for that. I'm keeping an eye on time and making sure that we can hear from you. I think that the audience heard enough from me earlier, and that's why I'm going to move on to Rana. I mean, Rana, we've heard energy already a lot. It's not surprising. We were expecting it. It's good news. Of course, it's a pity that we didn't hear the good news, that we don't have more good news to say, but it's good news that when we discuss transport, we are also having the energy nexus in mind there. But the statistic or the figure prevails, isn't it? It's 96% of the energy used in transport is coming from fossil fuels, and that share has remained stable over the decade. Okay, how do we break the dependency of the transport sector on fossil fuels? So what are you seeing from the REN 21 perspective? REN 21, from whom we actually take the inspiration with our global status report, because you have many years in your back as an organization on producing your own global status reports on different aspects. So please tell us a bit how are things evolving there?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Marusha, and also from my side, congratulations, actually. Since we're working on the global status report from our side, we know what a massive effort is there and coming up with a great data figures and also bring this community together of contributors. So that's really fantastic work. I must say, listening to all of you, actually, I thought like, wow, you made my day, because I really felt that 3 years ago, we would have had similar discussions. Nobody actually would have mentioned clean energy or renewable energy and how important energy is, or the dependence on fossil fuel. It would have been like the avoid, shift, improve, and maybe the fuel part would have been mentioned in the improve part, maybe. So I think it's great. Probably also SLOCAT, REN 21 working together on this topic, it has contributed. Let's be really honest, the global energy crisis and inflation has contributed. Now, what do we see actually here? And I think this is, I see like a crisis as an opportunity. So basically what we observe here in this discussion is something which we have also observed in media analysis. So we saw that during the last year, for instance, when we were looking into transport and energy, basically in 2022, the mentions of energy, of fossil fuel, of renewable energy has increased significantly over 2021. And what does this show? It does show that the attention is actually there. There is another attention to this topic. And I think that is something which is, even though the past is statistically, we still don't see a movement, at least not quick enough. We see actually positive indicators. So there is another attention. The energy transition has moved out of an energy expert discussion into an economic discussion, into sectoral discussions, and into societal discussions. That's a reality. We see that there are an increasing number of countries. Giatti, you had mentioned, for instance, Europe, but we also see that there has been increasing, you see there's the US Inflation Reduction Act to mention, India, China, with very comprehensive measures basically on the energy transition that do also comprise developments, sectoral targets, for instance, also transport targets and renewable targets for transport. And still, it's not enough. Why is it not enough? I think, and this is, I'm going to point out some of the barriers, but also some of the solutions we see here. I think one part is renewable energy has increasingly been seen by transport players as a response to a resilient energy, an affordable energy, and an energy that does not have the same fluctuating cost as fossil fuel. And this is actually, so ultimately is something which we collectively need to look at. It's what is the economic story of renewable energy in the transport sectors? I'm deliberately saying transport sectors because the solutions will differ very much, whether we speak about public transport, we speak about road, rail, freight, etc. But we need to work on the economic stories. There's an opportunity. We see that there are some really inspiring stories. I think I was participating in the I think what the General Assembly, Lucy, right, from UIC. This was actually happening the day where SNCF, the French rail, has announced their commitment to renewable energy. 10% of own production, 30% of renewable energy share by, if I'm not mistaken, 2030. It was, maybe it's 2040, no, 2030, I think, pretty soon, which shows, what does it show? It's an economic story, but the transport sector very often also has infrastructure to offer to the renewable energy players. So there is space, especially in space-constrained environments and countries. There is a value proposition of the transport sectors that can also be reflected in, for instance, business models. we see, and I think from the discussion here, a much more integrated approach than what at least me as a non-transport player did observe, let's say, like 3 to 5 years ago. So I think there is also an opportunity to push it out, not only from the, so just as an example, I think that in many of the events I participated in, very often we directly refer back and default back to road and cars, and we don't speak about the walking and cycling part, but also not about the public transport side and not about the freight side, which is also very much on the shipping. So I think there is an evolution of acknowledging that there is a system change. So only looking at transport. So I think just pushing this a bit more and have broader boundaries on energy and including this basically into this is something which is easy to do, because both sectors struggle with one part. And I'm going to end on this one, which is our dependence on fossil fuel. In both transitions, we have draggers and drivers. And the draggers is the fossil fuel industry. And it is sectors that are depending on fossil fuel. So I think the automotive industry is probably not always very happy about the bans of internal combustion engines, for example. So I think this is really something which we need to address. The other part where we have a joint part is like fossil fuel subsidies. And fossil fuel subsidies represented $1 trillion in 2022, which is 85% more than we had in 2021. And I'm only speaking about direct subsidies to fossil fuel. I'm not even speaking about the indirect one. So what I see here is, you mentioned, I think, $2.7 trillion required for the transport transition. When you're looking at the G20 declaration from last weekend, there was like an annual of $4 trillion. At least, let's say we take the 4 trillion, which was on all clean transitions, I think. We already have 25% of this by shifting basically fossil fuel subsidies, direct fossil fuel subsidies. And here I'm going to add, I think the avoid, shift, improve is actually a good concept, because we need to apply the same on the energy side. So it's about avoiding energy consumption. It's shifting to the same services, but less energy consuming, and shifting the fuel. So we have concepts here that align, and this also means that the transport sector, I think, can actually position itself as a much stronger ally of the players in the energy transition. And I think this is really an opportunity which all of us should pick up today. There is obviously from the government side a massive attention to the energy security and to energy cost. It is directly linked to global inflation. And this means very clearly that showing that the transport sector is a massive ally to players on the energy side, to reducing the energy demand by walking, cycling, public transport, so the whole modal shift part, but also by being an investor in energy consumer, large energy consumer, is a massive opportunity.
Thanks very much, Rana. I think I find it always extremely interesting to see how that notion of avoid, shift, improve, that it's so central to the movement that SLOCAT galvanizes around a sustainable low carbon transport, also resonates and can resonate with the renewables movement and the energy movement in general. I think that makes it probably a very good narrative for us to communicate, isn't it? And how interesting, isn't it, that we have to get to this point, as you have just reminded us, to be able to open conversations that we couldn't even really have. I mean, mentioning these conversations about fossil fuel dependency would oftentimes almost kick you out of the room in certain places. So thanks very much for showing us that there is an opening there for changing mindsets, for changing policies and changing subsidies. And all of these, I think that a lot of what we've heard from Lucy and from Andrea, and as well from Rana now, I'm not mentioning you, Alan, I think you'll understand that why. It's because we are very much talking about putting people at the center of mobility systems. I'm talking here passenger transport in particular. And of course, well, how can we do that when at the same time I'm telling you that over the past decade we haven't seen any improvement in the toll of a death provoked in traffic crashes? And how can we say that when we know that there's vulnerable users of the roads I think that was evoked by Martina earlier on, like cyclists and pedestrians that are really struggling to preserve the mode they use, whether it's walking or cycling, or are not daring to go there out of safety. Holger, what's the way forward? Back to you.
Thanks, Marusha.
And I'm going to just do something, if you allow me. Sorry, I should have not interrupted you, but I just realized I want to, encourage our audience to start, dropping some thoughts in the chat box if they want. And also, perhaps I'm going to encourage you all, my fellow panelists, to be much shorter than what we were in the first round. So then we can go in a bit more of conversation. I am not going to cut you, but you know that as I turn on the mic and start making noises, I would like you to perhaps move on a bit. Sorry, Holger, back to you.
I was actually extending also my contribution, to saying, well, we have this like often a people-centered approach, but even as freight is in fact finally it's about people actually getting them better access to goods as well as services. So I think we're also on the same page here. But to your question, I'd like to separate here two things. One is safety on walking and cycling, and one is then also on public transport, more with a focus in factors on security. So let's not forget, so pedestrians are actually the most vulnerable road users. They also have 600,000 road fatalities every year. So as you showed, also numbers not going down, mostly also in low middle income countries. And in terms of a solution, actually, it's obviously every city is slightly different, and Andrea mentioned also like complete streets have to look also different in different places. Nevertheless, it's two things. It's one also reduces the exposure, so have dedicated space, so have decent sidewalks, have decent cycle paths. We have seen also during COVID you can actually do that relatively quickly, and also then you have less exposure also for those. Second, very simple, is speed. According to World Bank, about 90% of people have a chance surviving hit by a car or a truck at 30 kilometers. Only less than 50% at 50 kilometers and higher. So simple as that, also reduces the speed of the dangerous vehicles, and you get there, and you see also more and more cities are coming also with legislation and project. Second is really about, have to talk here more, and we heard is about the issue of inclusion and challenges facing around public transport. So they are mostly also safer from a road safety perspective, but less so in terms of also the security risk also for women. So I just learned, and I just make some advertisement here for High Volume Transport podcast, where we also looked into gender, as well as spoke to experts on disabilities. 80% of women in Kenya were exposed also to sexual harassment. And there is a wide range of measures. And we heard also Lucy saying also female drivers is one, dedicated space, awareness. So I think it's so important also to make that also far more so in the heart of the question of inclusion. And finally, I'd like to draw his attention also to people with disabilities. So more than 1 billion people, according to WHO, suffer from some sort of disability. So and here you have, there's already in places like Kenya where there's actually advanced legislation saying, oh, you actually have also the right as a disabled passenger should have the same right also to access. And there's some technical issues like for matatus where you can have a ramp, have a dedicated space. But talking to expert and wonderful wheelchair users, so she's like, well, I'm there as just passing by, because I'm actually I have to wait and can't get actually to the jobs. And so I think the far more is awareness around us is these important issues of inclusion, and the solutions are all there. But on the technical side, on also like the policy side, but we need also far more awareness. So to sum up, actually, it's about also designing our cities for all people, and this is how we make also more cities more livable, more inclusive, and more accessible for all.
Thanks, Holger. Thanks a lot. somehow this resonates with avoiding and shifting, if I may, just to get myself a cue to move into the next set of questions, which resonate a bit more with improve. Because what I wanted to ask Lucy here stems from the reality that railway is the most electrified of modes, and sometimes that goes a bit unattended, isn't it? That doesn't make it on the news necessarily when we're talking about electrification. At the same time, we know that there's a split there, approximately half and half between diesel and electric right now in 2021. So what do you see companies doing to actually improve this split towards electrification, and also to reduce the emissions, of course, that come from the diesel rails?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you say 50-50 is not bad. 50-50 is not bad. You know, we're pretty well electrified.
Compared to other modes, certainly not.
We've been electrified for for a long time. In fact, and the technology is clear and proven, and it's really not a technological challenge, that's for sure. And in fact, it's very easy that rail could win the race to be 100% fossil free. Definitely, and I think that's really our ambition and the ambition of our members and they're all really committing to be fossil free, phase out, get to net zero before 2050. 39 of the railway companies in our membership have signed on the dotted line with us to say that that's exactly what they're planning to do. But we've seen a real regional difference here. So yes, in Europe, more than 50% is electrified infrastructure, and in fact, they're the busy lines. So in terms of passenger or freight kilometers, it's more like 80% is electric journey. But in Swiss are 100%, of course. But Africa, it's just under 15. But in the Americas, it's not even 1% of their infrastructure is electrified. So it's a massive regional difference that we UIC want to try and sort of bridge that gap, and really as a global organization to try and bring sort of learning from region to region to really sort of help level up and really look at how we address particularly those regions that have lower levels of electrification, because the overhead line works really, really well in high traffic areas, especially Rana, I hope you'll appreciate this, if planned with renewable energy expansion and production, it works brilliantly. So if you plan your renewable energy expansion at the same time as you're electrifying your public transport, their business case fit together and they support each other. And so we've seen that, say, the Ethio-Djibouti Railway, which is a bi-national company that run the railway through from Ethiopia to port in Djibouti. It's 100% renewable. They planned a brand new hydroelectric at the same time as they planned a new electric railway, and that base demand from railways guaranteed and bolstered the business case to invest in renewables in that country as well. So there's lots of advantages of really thinking strategically to be able to really boost electrification in many countries. And if it's not right to do overhead lines, it could be discontinuous wires. We're trying to make it cheaper and easier to do. So you can do it if you've got a battery on board. You can now you don't have to have the wires all along the way. If you've got tunnels, if you've got bridges and things like that. And hydrogen is part of the mix for higher power, longer range connectivity. So in the US, for example, in the US freight business, they're seriously looking at those kind of options. Those regions and particularly low and middle income countries have really got an opportunity to leapfrog the technologies and make that step forward. But it's all down to investment, isn't it? And it's all down to what is quite a capital intensive project, and that knowledge transfer that has to happen with it as well, to make sure that it's the knowledge of how to decarbonize the railway is transferred. And that's really what we want to try and do at the UIC. But at the end of the day, like we are, even if you compare a diesel train and diesel trucks, you know the shift will make a really important impact on reducing energy demand and reducing emissions as well. So that shift is really important. So let's do that. Let's make the shift happen. Rail expansion, decarbonisation, all in national policy and plans, and then hopefully climate finance would follow that.
Thanks very much, Lucy. I think you are bringing here this important point of using a the electrification of transport as a way to spearhead as well the access to energy in many countries and the transition to renewables. And if we do that hand in hand, wow, isn't it? It would be quite something. Thanks for that. We're going to continue talking electrification, but because we also want to address it in the informal transport sector. As for us, it's also something that, of course, as Andrea told us, is essential to this transformation. We have this data point, Andrea, that tells us that the fuel economy of informal transport vehicles in Africa is between 2 to 3 times worse than in the countries where those vehicles are imported from. So what is the electrification potential here? But fundamentally, how do we use that electrification potential that we know we have in informal transport? Please.
Thanks, Marusha. Well, the potential is enormous from the market share of these modes in the global south. The average that we've determined is that around 70% of the road trips on motorized vehicles in the global south are made with popular transport modes. So we could kind of make proportion. It's like, okay, maybe around 70% of the emissions of road transport are coming from the sector. We could actually have a lot of impact if we involve them in the transition towards electrification. But the good news is that it's already happening. And as I had mentioned before, this is a sector that hardly ever has any support from the government. But it's really interesting to see how the private sector has gotten in there and has developed really interesting business models so that the sector can electrify. So I'll give you a couple of examples. What we're seeing, for example, in Asia and in Africa are models for electric 2- and 3-wheelers that work with leasing and with battery swapping. The battery is the most expensive part of a vehicle. So if I sell you or lease the vehicle, but not the battery, it's much more accessible. And so what we're seeing is that actually 2- and 3-wheelers are the mode of transportation. It's the largest electrified fleet around the world. And it's because there have very innovative business models that are being developed to electrify these modes, but also in some countries, the government is stepping in and is developing incentives for these modes to electrify, especially in India and in China. We're seeing the electrification rates are really, really high, and they're the leaders in electrifying around the world. So it's really important that we think about what is necessary. Is it reducing the upfront cost? Is it operational differences in terms of costs as well that will make it accessible for these SMEs, as we were talking before? We're seeing that the potential for minibuses is really high, but the rates are not that high either. And minibuses are the most common modes of popular transportation, both in Africa and also in a lot of places in Latin America. So it's good that 2- and 3-wheelers are kind of going ahead, but we need to think a bit more about the electric buses and minibuses because the upfront cost is much higher. So there we need a little bit more support, for example, from governments, and also more diversity of options from OEMs to have electric minibuses and to have electric buses and business models that can also offer leasing options for the operators to not have to make that very high upfront cost. So the potential is enormous. The level of emissions reductions that we can achieve is actually much higher than electrifying public transport fleets in other places. But we actually need to basically crack the numbers and see how can we make this accessible for the SMEs and join up with public-private partnerships, develop incentives, but also finally, we need to standardize some things so that we end up having a transition that offers safe products, high quality products too, and products that will last a long time in the market and not break down. So there's a lot of R&D that needs to be done as well, R&I, sorry, and kind of testing and piloting so that we can determine which models are the best for these different contexts. But I think all of that is moving along. We need to kind of push it a bit more and have the electrification plans or strategies that are being drafted in each country or each city contemplate this sector. Again, the integration into planning involves this as well. So that definitely needs to be done as well.
Thanks very much, Andrea. Let me move with no further ado to Manis again. Giotti, you already talk about the proportion, isn't it, of monies that are going to public transport, and particularly to road transport from the G20. But there's always this question about scaling up. We are not seeing monies at the scale that we are needed compared to the needs that we've got. So how do we scale up investments?
So I think just to remind everyone, so these are the big trends, right? Most of the money is going to road transport, both as investments and also from climate finance. Emissions are going up, transport emissions are going up, driven by road transport. At the same time, they're continuously subsidized. The fossil fuel is subsidized, which benefits directly the road transport. And the fiscal incentives are put in place to promote road transport. So you see where this conversation is headed, that money is going to road transport. And if we want to really align the political goals with the climate and sustainability goals, then we really need to incentivize the right behavior. And right behavior is modal shift. In terms of the value for money and bang for the buck, the electrification of public transport, the railways, as we've heard from Lucy, in many of the regions is actually the marginal value is much less than what we can achieve from modal shift. And the conversation, and I think this is my big recommendation, the conversation has to really rise up from departments of railway, department of roads or highways or Ministry of Transport. It has to rise up all the way to Ministry of Finance, because this is a fiscal issue. This is not a transport issue. And these fiscal incentives, which are put in place for subsidies, for carbon pricing, for carbon markets, even today, the carbon markets are more active in maritime and in aviation. They are not designed for road, land-based transport. And so as much as we want to move away and move towards sustainable, and I want to actually not even use this term decarbonization. We want to move towards adaptation and resilience. And that's where we need to move towards. So have the conversation at a larger scale, put the fiscal incentives to the goals which we want to achieve, and not just focus on political goals.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Giotti. I mean, we are in the center of a conversation about economics, isn't it? The economics that are working or not for the type of transport paradigms that we want to have. Thanks so much for that. Alan, a lot is said about companies not disclosing enough information, about companies just ticking off boxes, of corporate social responsibility. At the same time, we're also seeing a big number of companies that are starting to disclose their actions in terms of reducing emissions and also corporate social responsibility. What is the key to make sure that it's not just ticking a box, what we are seeing? If you had to give us a magic formula.
Yeah, maybe I'm not a complete wizard, but I'll have a go. So yeah, firstly, great to see an increase in corporate reporting. But it's only a first step, as I think you're alluding to. Companies, it takes a lot of effort to report to CDP. There's a lot of information that's required in there. They don't do that lightly. I mean, at SFC, we've seen a huge increase in the number of members that we've got that are looking into transport emissions, particularly the Scope 3. So we see that there is a greater recognition. But at the same time, it's still also only scratching the surface of that. If I think back to 2018, we actually joined forces with CDP and published a joint report that looked at the quality and the consistency of the transport-related reporting in the CDP reports. And it's fair to say that it was patchy at best. So since then, we've been working to address that, specifically looking at the detail of reporting templates to give us the sort of information that we need, because what's in a CDP report tends to be inconsistent and not really at the level of detail that actually would allow us to track what's happening in the freight sector by our members, let alone more broadly. So it's a little bit disappointing that it takes a long time to make changes in that system, but that. Are you still there? Because my screen completely changed at that point.
We are here.
Okay.
On backstage, what's going on?
Okay. All right. Fine. I
We
won't.
can see you.
Yeah. Okay.
It was the magic. It was
you're
the
back.
magic wizards, but
Yeah.
doing wrong things.
Yeah. You're back. It was just disconcerting. I wondered whether my connection had failed.
You're on. You're on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that.
Yeah, okay. So we've been working really hard to change that, but it does take time. We've embedded all the work that we've done now into DEC framework and new ISO 14083, which looks at calculation, reporting, published this year. CDP is going to align with that, all that. So that harmonization and just lining up all the actors, it takes time, but it's in place. The problem you've got there is that reporting is only one aspect and it doesn't guarantee reduction of emissions. So you need to get companies to also put in place what we call emission reduction plans or sustainable logistics reduction plans for the freight sector. And it requires, again, those shippers to understand the role that they have in driving those decisions through the purchase mechanisms of logistics service providers and carriers. So direct relationships aren't necessarily always there in the sector. So it takes a lot of change. It's a much change in mindset as it is anything else. But the economics feeds into that as well. And it also then needs to align with the likes of Science Based Targets Initiative. At the moment, for transport, it's only maritime sector, and I think air sector is almost there with a 1.5 degree pathway through SBTI. The road, the rail are still there under 2 degree pathway. So we're actually working with them. We're just starting on a project to refresh that as well. So yeah, again, that will take a little bit of time, but it's really important because the companies need that to really tie that into what they can commit. They're under pressure to do it from investors, from shareholders, from public. So that's all good.
Sure. Thanks very much, Alan. I mean, we are seeing therefore here the importance of sending clear signals to the market, but
absolutely
also very ambitious targets, because yeah, I mean, we know that some of the targets that are being set by whether it is ICAO or MIO are not going to get us to where we need in a 1.5 scenario. They remain pledges, they remain aspirational, they remain at best a scenario. So it's great that we're going in that direction, and it's great that you're reminding us about the importance of those science-based targets that are really the only ones we should be talking about here.
Yeah.
Links to what Jyoti was saying, no politics, science, what we need, isn't it? So talking about politics and talking about the complexity of trying to make headway in heavy political scenarios, Rana, I wanted to go back to you and, of course, bring here the Russian invasion of Ukraine again into the picture and how it has fueled the energy prices in the transport sector. We have seen the International Energy Agency putting out their 10-point plan, isn't it, for reducing the dependency on fossil fuels and for reducing the reliance on Russian natural gas. So how can high-income countries really go about that? How do you see that 10-point plan by IEA getting us into the right direction or not? I allow you to be controversial. I know you can be. Allow us.
Actually, what is interesting is I'm just sitting.
I'm going to give you a challenge. It's a 2-minute answer max. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yes. No, but what's funny is I'm currently at IEA because I had meetings here. So I'm talking to you about what IEA is basically putting out as a plan from IEA without being IEA. So a first part is, and I'm just going to build on what Ellen just said. I have posted it in the chat. I think one part is very clearly data and monitoring. We see that renewable energy data in the consumption is very often not disaggregated from the energy consuming sectors. This is something that is really fundamental if we want to better monitor what is happening in the energy consuming side, so in the transport sector, on the fuel side, and how basically to build the synergies. Now, when we're looking, IEA has indeed put out a 10-point plan on the dependence on Russian gas, but also on lowering the dependence, how the transport sector could lower the dependence on oil. So what is interesting is, I'll start with the oil part from the transport sector. They don't actually speak about the fuel switch. which I think is something where we still see a disconnect, and that's a disconnect I would say we see in the observations and the answers of governments to the crisis. It seemed that this crisis has led to the energy security crisis, and as such, governments, national governments, have shifted even more to looking at this from the supply side and not considering the fact that the energy consumers are a key lever. So I think this is basically one part where we see a disconnect in answering. The other part is it's obviously about a diversification of natural gas from Russian gas. And I think this is a risk which I would also like to speak about. We see that many governments do look into efficiency and renewables and also what can happen on the transport sector, industry, agriculture, building. But we also see that many governments as such invest more in new infrastructure on the natural gas side and on oil. And so I think there's a recent part that 1/3 of the new investment in oil and gas is actually happening in the US. And this is going in pair with the Inflation Reduction Act and the focus on the energy transition. So I think this is just an alert here. And the other part is very clearly electrification of energy sectors, fuel switch. So again, avoid, shift, improve on the energy side. The transport sector is not specifically, or the energy consuming sectors and how they can actively contribute are not mentioned. And I think this is, I'm just going to end on this, Marusha, from the energy side, really a call on you're a key ally on the energy transition. You're a key ally in the answer to energy security. So I think there is an opportunity to really bring this to the forefront and ask in parallel for more support and funding on avoid and shift.
Thanks very much, Rana, Madam Chair of the SLOCAT Board of Directors. Very much appreciated. I'm going to give a challenge to all of you as the speakers, and it's a challenge because it's going to force you to, of course, think quickly here. So it's a bit of a takeaway message. I'm filling up time so you can start thinking about the takeaway message. But the double challenge is that I'm really going to give you seconds, each of you. So I really need you to think about it as a tweet. The Global Status Report is produced every 2 years. I know it's immediate what I'm talking about. It's not a long-term transformation. But what could be that key thing that you would like us to be reporting as good news in the 4th edition of the Global Status Report from the perspective of what you've just covered in this panel? So think about 2026. We are launching the 4th edition of the GSR, and we are saying, hey, this happened and it was great news. Who wants to get started? I need a bit of quickness here. Anybody feeling ready? I was filling up time, but who wants to go? Andrea, thank you. You're always there to save me. Go ahead.
So one of the things that we saw was that there were no countries that were including popular transport in their NDCs. So what I would like to see is that at least 10 countries around the world are now including popular transport in their NDCs and efforts to decarbonize it and improve it.
And extremely timely because the next NDCs are in 2025. That's when they are due. Brilliant. Who wants to go next?
Okay, I'll dive in.
I see Lucy and Rana, so it's going to be Lucy and then Rana, yeah?
Yeah, so obviously that Chile have double death rates, and and not just Chile, but globally we're seeing that move and really the climate finance starting to flow into railways and make that investment, and because of the fact that those NDCs, of course, have boosted the rail content and really seeing railways as a climate solution. Excellent,
Rana, and then Jyoti. Great.
Two things. Building on the NDCs, obviously, that there will be an increase of 50%, let's say, of countries that have renewable energy in transport target mentioned in the NDC that goes beyond biofuels. The other one is that we manage to report on integrated planning and policies between the transport and the energy sector.
Okay, I gave you two because you are the chair. But let's make sure that you're
sorry.
No, I'm kidding. Jyoti, Alan, and Holger, last but not least.
Okay, in 2 years, I want to. I'm sorry.
we can hear you well. Don't worry. So
Okay.
on your side.
Okay. In 2 years, I want to see a tweet like adaptation financing and renewable energy financing has finally surpassed fossil fuel subsidies.
Ah, wow. I also want to see that. I want to see everything you're saying, but that one would be such a game changer. Alan, tell us, what do you see?
I want to see a working digital data sharing network to support greenhouse gas calculations. It's progressing, but it would really help that reporting and make the target setting tracking much more timely. I'm
so happy that you're talking about tools for data and data literacy and monitoring and knowing where we're heading. Thanks very much for that. Holger, last but
not picking one, but actually saying also like all the work in all the chapter from all the great people as we're having here have been really accelerated and scaled so that we are on a trajectory also to low carbon sustainable transport.
Well, I get you. Integrated, intermodal, multidimensional transport. That's what we need, isn't it? Thank you very much, everyone, for this impressive panel. I very much appreciate all the efforts you've put over all these months and how you also have kept time to be here with us today. I want to bring it back to Alice to wrap us up, but thanks very much on behalf of all of us in SLOCAT. Alice, please, the floor is yours to wrap us up in a couple of minutes then.
Thank you, Marusha and our panelists, for such a fruitful discussion. Let's end with some very important thoughts. Collective, active, and electrified transport is the way forward. We already know what's needed to transform our transport mobility systems, and all that is missing is action at the scale and the speed required. And next slide, please. All stakeholders across the board must revolutionize their level of ambition, action, and accountability towards the structural transformation of transport systems. The transformation of transport systems will not happen overnight, but the end results will be worth it and will have society-wide positive impacts. And this is the call to action of the Global Status Report that we have presented to you today. What are we waiting for? What are you waiting for? Next slide, please. Today only marks the beginning of an exciting journey of knowledge and intellectual exchanges. We will carry out a series of activities and products in the coming years, such as podcasts and infographic series. So stay tuned on our website and social media. We bid you farewell for now, and thank you so much again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you around.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.